Okay, guys, this is a simplified approach to the AS level Weimar Germany exam. Okay, so if we have a quick look at question one, this is obviously the sources question. So just to remind you what the focus of the question is going to ask you how valuable are the sources to a historian studying, and the examiner will pick a specific topic. It could be the policies of Gustav Stresemann, the impact of the Treaty of Versailles. It could be Germany after the First World War, or the rise of Adolf Hitler, for example. So just to remind you quickly what the exam script will look like, you will have three primary sources. All of these sources will have the provenance or attribution underneath. And as I've said, the focus of the question will be asking you how valuable are these sources. So in this case, it was asking these students how valuable are these sources studying the opposition to the Weimar Republic between 1920 and 1932. Okay, so in terms of how to structure this answer, this is a very, very simple approach. You don't need an introduction. That's very, very important. And in terms of structure, dead simple. Source one, then source two, source three, and then a conclusion where you make an overall judgment at the end. So in terms of worrying about structure, it's nice and simple. So this is the type of thing you will have. This is an extract from Mein Kampf, Hitler's book that he wrote in Landsberg prison in 1924. And this is how you would potentially approach a source like this. Now, the way you've been taught in class is to approach it using the Chattel-J formula, which is a fairly bulletproof way of approaching each of these questions. However, each of these sources. However, I'm going to give you an alternative way of approaching this. If you're finding Chattel-J a little bit difficult and challenging, this is an alternative approach to take. So in terms of each of the sources, this is the two words you can think of, what and who. So in other words, what does the source say? So a typical example of a sentence starter could be, the source is valuable because it tells us. So if we go back a couple of slides to look at this source, for example, it would be a case of, this source is valuable because it tells us about Hitler's thoughts towards Jews, known as anti-Semitism. And then you could give a couple of examples from the sources. For example, in the source, it says A, B, and C. So in terms of the first part, what does the source say? That's fairly straightforward. Just tell us what the valuable information is in the source. If you can, add a little bit of own knowledge to that as well. Okay, so for example, in that source, it was valuable because it tells us about Hitler's anti-Semitism. Tell us a little bit about what you know about Hitler's anti-Semitism. It could be something like he grew up in a anti-Semitic part of Austria. His experiences in the First World War, he blamed Jews for the First World War. So if you have any own knowledge about the extract, then just add it. I mentioned earlier that he was imprisoned in Landsberg prison in 1923-24 when he wrote that. So add that detail there. So the second part, who is saying it? This is where you looked at the author of the source. You've said what the source says. The second part is just telling us a little bit about the author and talking about potentially the strengths or limitations of the author. So it could be a case of, this source was produced by Adolf Hitler. This is valuable because Adolf Hitler was the leader of the Nazi party, and his views on Jews were typical of right-wing nationalists. Okay, you could say the source was produced to try and influence people and try and spread hate about Jews. And then similarly, you could talk about limitations of the source. You could say, well, this is clearly biased, clearly emotive, and clearly one-sided. However, it is still valuable. So in terms of approaching these sources, what does the source say and who is saying it? If we have a look at the conclusion, then you repeat that process for the three sources. And what you've got to do in the conclusion is you've got to talk about all three sources together and just answer the question, really. So the question is, how valuable are these sources to historians studying, let's say, the views of Adolf Hitler? So you can say, overall, these sources are valuable to a historian because they, and again, I'm making this up. Let's imagine there were three sources, and this could be an answer. They tell us a variety of Hitler's views, including anti-Semitism, anti-capitalism, and pro-military, for example. These sources also give us a variety of opinion. So it's not just Hitler. Another source might be Goebbels, and another one might be an ordinary German citizen. So you're talking about how valuable they are as a set and making a clear judgment. Overall, I think they are largely valuable, somewhat valuable, valuable to an extent, and so on and so forth. Just be careful not to state that the sources have no value, because obviously all sources have value. If we move on to question two then, okay, which is looking at historical interpretations. This is a different question. So instead of having primary sources, you will now have what we call extracts. So these are going to be the views of historians. So in this case, we've got a historian writing in 1965 and a historian writing in 1998. And the question will be something like this. How valid is the view that the Treaty of Versailles was the main reason for the rise of the Nazi Party by 1933? So they will give you an original interpretation. And what I would always advise, okay, is highlighting that interpretation before you begin. So, what you've looked at in class is a fairly complex structure which looks at 3D 123J. Now, I'm going to assume that perhaps you're finding that a little bit difficult. That could be for timing reasons, or you just want to look at a simplified way of approaching this exam. If that is the case, this is an option for you. You can completely get rid of the 3D introduction, and you can go straight into the essay by talking about extract 1. Then you can talk about extract 2. Then you can talk about something called an OPI, another interpretation. And then finally, you can come up with a judgment overall, which we'll talk about in a second. So as I mentioned, I would get your green highlighter and I would highlight the original interpretation in green. So in this case, the Treaty of Versailles was the main reason for the rise of the Nazi Party. And then when you look at source 1, I've obviously done this one for you. Any evidence that agrees with the original interpretation, so in this case is talking about the importance of the Treaty of Versailles, goes in one colour. You will always, almost certainly, get two extracts that have different viewpoints. You can see interpretation 2, for example, more or less completely disagrees and talks about the importance of things like the Great Depression and the global economic collapse, for example. So one says agree, another one says disagree. And this is how I would encourage you to approach each of these extracts. Again, think about two words. How does the extract agree or disagree, and why does it agree or disagree? So the first bit is fairly straightforward. How does it agree or disagree? Well, if you look at the colors that you've used to highlight, this one clearly disagrees. So all you're going to do in your answer is write the following. The extract disagrees with the interpretation because it says, and then you just use information from the source. It talks about the Great Depression. It talks about the failure of Weimar democracy. It talks about the economic catastrophe. And the same thing again, if you know anything about the Great Depression or the failures of the Weimar, just add a little bit of own knowledge in there. So nice and simple. How does the extract agree or disagree? And then you're saying, well, why does this historian agree or disagree? And this is where you have a little look at the provenance or the attribution at the bottom. So, for example, this historian is writing in 1998, many, many decades after the events. So, this gives this historian the ability to have lots of hindsight. This historian is building upon the work of historians before. This historian is likely to have a real wide range of sources because it's quite modern. You've got more and more sources available. And also, this historian seems to be taking quite a broad look at this event because this historian is talking about lots of different events. So, therefore, was taking a more revisionist viewpoint or looking at history through a wider lens. So, when you've written paragraphs for both of them, you should be in a pretty good position. The next bit is very important, okay? So, as I've said, if I go right back to the structure guide a second, you've got extract 1, extract 2, and then another possible interpretation. So this is a little bit tricky, okay? This is where you've got to come up with a third interpretation that is either within the extracts or something completely of your own. And this is how I would recommend that you approach this. So this is all hypothetical, but let's say we had an exam where extract 1 said Hitler was responsible for the fall of the Weimar. Extract 2, the historian is saying, actually, it was the Wall Street crash that was responsible for the fall of the Weimar Republic. What you've got to do is you've got to come up with your own uh, other possible interpretation or your own interpretation that is different. So, for example, you could say, well, it could be the Wall Street crash as well as the weaknesses of Weimar politicians. So, in other words, it's a combination of different factors. Or you could pick something that was completely different. You could say it was down to the Treaty of Versailles. You could say it was down to the failures of Hindenburg and all of his leaders. You could pick anything that is different. If you're stuck in the exam, there's nothing wrong with having a combination of both. So in this case, you would say it was a combination of both Hitler's skills and the Wall Street crash. And what happens then in the conclusion is you write that out. You say another interpretation not found in the extract is that, and again, I'll say I'm going to argue the effect of the First World War was the main reason for the fall of the Weimar, and then say from my own knowledge and tell the examiner a little bit about it. The First World War ended. The Germans were made to sign the Treaty of Versailles. This led to resentment and bitterness. This led to economic problems. This led to the stab in the back myth. And I'm just going to let the examiner know I know a little bit about this. And then the final part, which is your judgment, is really, really straightforward. It brings us to the end of the essay. Okay, and we've done extract 1, extract 2, and an OPI. And in that final judgment, we very simply got to say, overall, do you agree or disagree with the original interpretation? And then give me a reason why. So it could be, overall, I disagree with the original interpretation because I believe that the Wall Street crash was actually the most significant factor because it brought on the Great Depression in Germany. Or, overall, I disagree with the original interpretation because I believe Adolf Hitler as a leader was the most significant factor due to his excellent speech-making skills and his propaganda. So all you've got to do is answer the question directly, and that will take you right to the end of the essay. So you're just telling the examiner, what do you think about the question? Hopefully that was useful.